The jeers and cruel laughter echoed across the dusty town square of Red Creek, Colorado, as Lillian Anderson stood trembling at the auction block, her cheeks burning with humiliation beneath the scorching July sun of 1885. The placard around her neck read simply, "Mail order bride damaged goods," marking her as an object of ridicule rather than the hopeful bride she journeyed west to become. Lillian stared at the dirt beneath her worn boots, unable to meet the eyes of the crowd that had gathered for her shame. 2 weeks ago, she'd arrived from Boston, summoned by a promise of marriage to a cattle baron who'd promptly rejected her upon discovering she'd once worked as a dance hall girl to support her ailing mother. Now, with no money to return east and her reputation in tatters, the town council had decided to auction her off to recoup the cost of her room and board. "Who'll take this fine specimen?" cackled Mayor Perkins, a portly man with yellowed teeth and greedy eyes. "Might not be pure as driven snow, but she's got all her teeth and can likely cook a decent meal. Starting bid is $5. Silence fell over the crowd. Men shifted uncomfortably, some snickering, others averting their eyes. Women whispered behind gloved hands, their judgment cutting deeper than any knife could. "Come now," the mayor continued, his voice edged with mockery. "Surely one of you fine gentlemen needs someone to warm your bed. $4, then?" Lillian's fingers clenched around the frayed edges of her shawl. 22 years old, and her life had come to this, being auctioned like cattle to whoever would take her, if anyone would at all. A tear slid down her cheek, but she refused to sob, refused to give them the satisfaction. $3? No takers? Mayor Perkins shook his head in exaggerated disappointment. "Well, I suppose we could always send her to work at Madame Ruby's establishment. Though even she might have standards too high for $50. The deep voice cut through the murmurs like a knife. The crowd parted as a tall figure on horseback approached the auction block. Dust swirled around the stranger as his dappled gray stallion came to a halt before the platform. From beneath the wide brim of his worn Stetson, piercing blue eyes surveyed the scene with quiet intensity. Owen McCall sat straight in his saddle, one hand resting casually on his holstered Colt. His face, tanned and weathered from years under the western sun, betrayed no emotion, but something in his eyes flickered dangerously as he looked from Lillian to the mayor. $50, he repeated, his voice carrying across the now silent square. "And the lady walks away from this nonsense right now." Mayor Perkins sputtered, his small eyes widening at the unexpected intervention. "Now see here, McCall. This is town business, seems to me," Owen interrupted, dismounting with fluid grace despite his tall frame. "This is more like town cruelty. $50 is more than fair for whatever debts she might owe." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, tossing it to land with a heavy clink at the mayor's feet. The crowd whispered among themselves. Everyone knew Owen McCall, the lone rancher who kept to himself at Silverleaf Ranch 10 miles outside town. He rarely came to Red Creek except for supplies, and he certainly never involved himself in town affairs. No one could remember the last time he'd spoken more than 10 words together to anyone. "Well, I never," huffed Mrs. Winters, the banker's wife. "Has the world gone mad? A decent man like McCall claiming a fallen woman?" Owen ignored the whispers as he approached the platform, his spurs jingling with each purposeful step. He extended his hand toward Lillian. "Madam, if you're willing, I'd be honored to escort you away from here." Lillian stared at the outstretched hand, hardly daring to believe what was happening. This stranger, this quiet, intimidating cowboy was offering her salvation. But at what price? She hesitated, studying his face for any sign of cruelty or lustful intent. Instead, she found only a steady gaze that seemed to hold something like empathy, carefully guarded beneath his stoic expression. The alternative was to remain at the mercy of a town that had already decided her worth or lack thereof. Lillian placed her trembling hand in his calloused palm. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Owen nodded once, then turned to face the mayor, his expression hardening. "Remove that sign from around her neck." "Now." Mayor Perkins, sensing the steel beneath Owen's quiet command, hastily complied, fumbling with the cord that held the degrading placard. "This ain't proper, McCall," called out Sheriff Wilson from the edge of the crowd. "You can't just buy a woman like, isn't that exactly what you were all doing?" Owen replied coolly. "Difference is, I'm offering her a respectable position as housekeeper at my ranch, with fair wages and her own cabin." He turned to Lillian. "If that suits you, Mississippi Anderson," she supplied. Lillian Anderson. Miss Anderson. The choice is yours to accept or decline. The sincerity in his voice nearly undid her. After weeks of being treated as less than human, to be addressed with respect and offered a choice felt like water to a woman dying of thirst. "I accept, Mr. McCall," she replied, straightening her shoulders despite her shabby dress and the whispers surrounding them. Owen helped her down from the platform with a surprising gentleness that belied his rugged appearance. He led her to his horse, collected the reins, and began walking toward the general store, ignoring the stares that followed them. "We'll need to get you some proper supplies before heading to Silverleaf," he said quietly. "It's not much, my ranch, but it's peaceful. You'll be safe there." Lillian struggled to keep pace with his long strides, her mind reeling from the sudden turn of events. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Owen was silent for so long that Lillian thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "I know what it's like to be judged unfairly by people who think they're better than you. No one deserves what they were doing to you back there." At Jameson's general store, Owen purchased practical items: sturdy boots, work dresses, a heavy coat for the coming winter, and basic toiletries. He conducted the entire transaction with minimal words, ignoring the curious stares of Mr. Jameson and the other customers who had hurried in to witness the strange development. "Add some of those peppermint sticks," Owen said as Jameson tallied the purchases. When the shopkeeper raised his eyebrows, Owen simply stared him down until the candies were added to their order. Outside the store, Owen secured their purchases to his saddle before turning to Lillian. "It's a fair ride to Silverleaf. Can you manage on horseback?" Lillian nodded, relieved at the prospect of leaving town. "I can ride, Mr. McCall." For the first time, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Owen," he corrected gently. "If we're to be sharing the same roof, even as employer and housekeeper, Mr. McCall seems overly formal." He helped her mount, then swung up behind her with easy strength. Lillian stiffened slightly at the proximity, but Owen maintained a respectful distance as much as the saddle allowed, his arms reaching around her only to hold the reins. As they rode out of Red Creek, the townsfolk watched from doorways and windows. Lillian kept her gaze forward, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her distress. Only when the town faded from view did she allow her shoulders to relax slightly. "Here," Owen said, reaching into his pocket and offering her one of the peppermint sticks. "My mother always said sweet things help after bitter moments." The simple kindness so unexpected brought fresh tears to Lillian's eyes. She accepted the candy with a murmured thanks, turning it over in her fingers. "You don't have to tell me anything about your past," Owen continued as they rode across the open prairie, golden in the late afternoon sun. "It's not my business. All I ask is honest work and that you don't steal from me. I don't expect anything improper." Relief washed over Lillian. "Thank you. I promise I'll earn my keep. I'm a good cook and I can clean, mend, garden." She stopped herself from babbling further. "I won't disappoint you." Owen was quiet for a moment before responding. "Folks disappoint each other all the time, Miss Anderson. It's part of living. I just aim to treat you fairly, and hope for the same in return." The sun was beginning to set when they crested a small rise, revealing a modest but well-maintained ranch in the valley below. A sturdy log house stood beside a large barn, with several corrals and a small bunkhouse nearby. Silverleaf Ranch wasn't grand, but it had a peaceful beauty about it, nestled against the backdrop of distant mountains. "It's lovely," Lillian breathed, taking in the sight of wildflowers dotting the surrounding meadows and the silver-leaved cottonwoods that had given the ranch its name. "It's home," Owen replied simply, but there was unmistakable pride in his voice. "Been building it up for 7 years now." As they approached, a weathered older man emerged from the barn, waving a greeting. "That's Hank," Owen explained. "My foreman and only full-time hand. Got 3 seasonal cowhands who'll be back when we start moving cattle next month." Hank Wheeler's eyebrows shot up when he saw Lillian, but to his credit, he recovered quickly, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Miss," he said respectfully, before turning curious eyes to Owen. "Miss Anderson will be taking over housekeeping duties," Owen explained, helping Lillian dismount. "She'll be staying in the cabin by the creek. I'll get it aired out right away," Hank offered, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled at Lillian. "Been empty since Mrs. Whitley left last fall. Nothing a good sweep won't fix, though." "Thank you," Lillian said, grateful for the man's matter-of-fact acceptance. The cabin was small but solid, with a main room containing a cast-iron stove, table, and chair, and a tiny bedroom just large enough for a narrow bed and chest of drawers. After months of uncertainty, and the humiliation of that morning, having a space to call her own felt like an unimaginable luxury. "It's not much," Owen said, standing awkwardly in the doorway as Lillian explored her new home. "It's perfect," she assured him, meaning it. They settled into a routine over the following days. Lillian rose early to prepare breakfast for Owen and Hank in the main house, spent the mornings cleaning and doing laundry, and the afternoons tending to the small vegetable garden that had been neglected. The men worked from dawn to dusk with the cattle and horses, repairing fences, and preparing for the upcoming cattle drive. Owen remained as quiet as ever, but Lillian gradually noticed small considerations that spoke volumes about his character. He had Hank bring her wildflowers to brighten the cabin. Fresh milk and eggs appeared on her doorstep each morning. When she mentioned enjoying reading, a small stack of books was delivered the next day without comment. One evening, a week after her arrival, Lillian was returning to her cabin after serving dinner when she heard music drifting from the barn. Curious, she followed the sound and found Owen sitting on a hay bale, playing a harmonica with his eyes closed. The mournful tune spoke of loneliness and yearning in a way his words never did. She must have made some noise, for his eyes suddenly opened, and the music stopped abruptly. "I'm sorry," Lillian said, embarrassed to have intruded on his private moment. "I heard the music and—" "No need to apologize." Owen tucked the instrument into his pocket. "My father taught me to play. Said music was good company when people weren't. It was beautiful," she offered. A shadow of vulnerability crossed his face before he masked it with his usual stoicism. "It helps me think." "What were you thinking about?" The question slipped out before she could stop herself. Owen studied her for a long moment. "The past. The future. Things that can't be changed and things that might be possible. That's quite a lot to fit into one tune," Lillian said with a small smile. To her surprise, Owen chuckled the first time she'd heard him laugh. The sound transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him appear younger, more approachable. Lillian found herself noticing the warmth in his blue eyes, the strength in his hands, the way his presence filled a room without effort. "You have a lovely laugh," she said without thinking. "You should use it more often." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of interest, perhaps even pleasure, quickly guarded. "Haven't had much cause for laughter these past years." "Well, perhaps that can change," Lillian replied, surprising herself with her boldness. "Good night, Owen." As the weeks passed, the quiet moments between them grew more frequent. Owen began lingering over breakfast, sharing stories about his horses or asking about her day. Lillian found reasons to bring him lemonade in the fields or to ask his opinion about changes to the garden. Neither acknowledged the growing connection, but Hank observed it with knowing eyes and a private smile. Summer heat gave way to the first crisp days of autumn. The seasonal hands arrived to help with the cattle, bringing with them news from town, including gossip about the fallen woman Owen McCall had, purchased, at auction. Lillian overheard their whispers one evening as she brought coffee to the bunkhouse. She froze outside the door, her stomach clenching at their crude speculations about her relationship with Owen. "Reckon McCall's finally decided he needs warming up during these cold nights," one voice drawled. "Smart man gets his house cleaned and his bed warmed all for the price of room and board. She's a pretty little thing, I'll give him that," another replied. "Wonder if she'd be willing to expand her services, that's enough." Owen's voice cut through the conversation like ice. Lillian hadn't realized he was in the bunkhouse. "Miss Anderson is an employee of this ranch, and will be treated with respect. Anyone who can't manage that can collect their pay and leave tonight." Silence followed his words. "I don't tolerate disrespect toward anyone who works for me," Owen continued, his voice dangerously quiet. "Is that clear?" A chorus of subdued "Yes, sir," responses followed. Lillian hurried away before she could be discovered, her heart pounding with a confusing mixture of gratitude, embarrassment, and something warmer she wasn't ready to name. Later that night, a knock came at her cabin door. Owen stood outside, his expression troubled in the lantern light. "May I come in for a moment?" he asked formally. Lillian nodded, stepping back to allow him entry. He removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "I wanted to apologize," he began. "For the men. They've been dealt with." "You have nothing to apologize for," Lillian assured him. "I heard what you said in my defense." "Thank you." Owen's gaze was intense. "I've been thinking, Miss Anderson, Lillian," she corrected gently. "If we're to be sharing the same roof, even as employer and housekeeper, Miss Anderson seems overly formal." She echoed his words from their first day with a small smile. That earned her another rare smile. "Lillian, then." He took a deep breath. "I've been thinking that your position here might be compromising your reputation further." Her smile faded. "Are you asking me to leave?" "No," he said quickly. "The opposite, actually. I wondered if you might consider a more permanent arrangement. One that would silence the gossips and provide you with security." He paused, visibly struggling with his words. "I'm not good at this sort of thing. What I'm trying to say is, would you consider marriage?" Lillian stared at him, speechless. Owen rushed on, misinterpreting her silence. "It wouldn't have to be a real marriage, not at first. You'd have your own room in the main house. I wouldn't expect. That is, there would be no obligations of that nature unless you wished it. But you'd have my name, my protection, a share in this place." He gestured vaguely toward the window, indicating the ranch beyond. "Why?" Lillian finally asked, the same question she'd posed that first day in town. "Why would you do this for me?" Owen set his hat on the table and took a step closer. "At first I helped you because it was the right thing to do. Now I find myself thinking about you when you're not there. Wondering what might make you smile. Looking forward to breakfast because it means I'll see you." His voice grew softer. "I know I'm not much of a catch, too quiet, too set in my ways. But I would be good to you, Lillian. I would never shame you or make you regret tying yourself to me." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes at the sincerity in his voice. No one had ever spoken to her with such honest regard. Not the men who had paid for her dances back east, not the cattle baron who had rejected her, and certainly not any of the townsfolk who had stood by during her humiliation. "I don't want a marriage of convenience, Owen," she said softly. His face fell, but he nodded, accepting her decision with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything. "I understand. The offer of employment still stands, of course. For as long as you wish to stay." "You misunderstand me," Lillian continued, reaching out to touch his arm. "I don't want a marriage of convenience because what I feel for you isn't convenient at all. It's confusing and wonderful and terrifying." Hope dawned in his eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if I marry you, it would be because I care for you. Because in these weeks, I've come to admire your kindness, your integrity, your quiet strength. Because when you play that harmonica in the evenings, I find myself wishing I could sit beside you and listen forever. Owen's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. I never dared hope you might feel something for a rough man like me. Perhaps we're both afraid to hope for happiness after what life has taught us, Lillian suggested. But I think I'd like to try if you would. The kiss, when it came, was gentle, tentative at first, then deepening as they each realized the other's feelings were genuine. Owen's arms encircled her with careful tenderness, as though she were something precious he feared might break. They were married 2 weeks later by the circuit preacher, with Hank and the ranch hands as witnesses. No one from Red Creek was invited, though news of the marriage spread quickly enough. Some scoffed at the unlikely match, the taciturn rancher and the disgraced mail-order bride, but neither Owen nor Lillian concerned themselves with the opinions of those who had shown such cruelty. Their wedding night was a discovery of tender passion neither had experienced before, not the mechanical transactions of Lillian's dance hall days nor the lonely isolation of Owen's solitary existence, but a genuine connection of two souls who had found unexpected sanctuary in each other. As autumn turned to winter, Lillian transformed the main house with small touches: curtains at the windows, quilts on the furniture, flowers even in December thanks to her careful cultivation of indoor plants. Owen found himself talking more, sharing stories of his childhood in Missouri, his dreams for the ranch, his hopes for their future. The first heavy snow of winter found them nestled before the fireplace, Owen playing his harmonica while Lillian worked on a tiny pair of booties, a Christmas surprise for the husband who had given her not just a home, but a future filled with possibility. When spring arrived, bringing wildflowers and new calves to Silverleaf Ranch, it also brought their daughter Sarah Elizabeth McCall, born with her mother's golden hair and her father's thoughtful blue eyes. Standing on the porch of their home, watching Owen gently rock their newborn while pointing out the cottonwoods that gave the ranch its name, Lillian reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her west. The humiliation that had seemed like the end of all her hopes had instead led her to the beginning of a new life, one built on respect, kindness, and a love that had grown from the most unlikely of circumstances. "What are you thinking about, wife?" Owen asked, catching her contemplative expression. "About how sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead us to the best," she replied, leaning against his shoulder and touching their daughter's tiny hand. "About how grateful I am that you rode into town that day." Owen pressed a kiss to her temple. "I rode in for fence supplies and coffee," he admitted with a wry smile. "Found a treasure instead." 5 years later, Lillian stood in that same spot, watching as Owen taught their son James to ride his first pony, Sarah running alongside them, her braids flying in the wind. Silverleaf Ranch had prospered under their joint care. The herd had doubled, the garden expanded into a productive orchard, and the once sparse homestead now boasted flower beds, a whitewashed fence, and the sound of children's laughter. Occasionally, they traveled to Red Creek for supplies they couldn't produce themselves. The townsfolk who had once mocked Lillian now watched with poorly disguised envy as the McCall family passed through the handsome rancher who no longer wore his solitude like armor, the beautiful wife whose grace belied her humble beginnings, and their children, bright-eyed and clearly cherished. Mayor Perkins had lost his position the year after Lillian's auction, when several prominent citizens led by the circuit judge who had married the McCalls deemed the event barbaric and contrary to civilized values. No apology ever came, but Lillian found she no longer needed one. The life she had built with Owen was vindication enough. On the anniversary of the day they met, Owen always presented her with a peppermint stick, a simple tradition that never failed to bring tears to her eyes and warmth to her heart. It reminded them both of how far they had come from that dusty town square, he from his self-imposed isolation, she from her public shame. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him once, as they sat on the porch swing watching the sunset paint the cottonwoods gold and silver. "Taking a chance on a woman no one else wanted?" Owen's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I think we both know I got the better end of that deal," he replied, his voice rich with contentment. "You brought life back to this place. To me." Lillian leaned into his embrace, marveling at how the man once known as the most taciturn rancher in the territory had learned to speak his heart so eloquently. Love, she had discovered, could transform even the most guarded soul just as it had healed her own wounded spirit. As twilight deepened over Silverleaf Ranch, Owen took out his harmonica and began to play not the mournful tune of their first encounter, but a lilting melody that spoke of joy found and cherished. Their children danced in the yard, fireflies beginning to spark in the gathering dusk, while Lillian rested her head against her husband's shoulder. The auction block that had once been her shame had become the unexpected first step on a journey to happiness. The cowboy who had claimed her that day had given her not just his name, but his heart, and in doing so, had helped her reclaim herself.